Policy issues. Policy issues are numerous, but they may be put into four categories: democracy and human rights issues, population issues, economic issues, and foreign policy and international trade issues. Democracy and human rights. The Chinese leaders that came to power after Deng's death in 1997 have not strayed significantly from Deng's path of economic reform and resistance to political reform. Jiang Zemin was the general secretary of the CCP from 1989 to 2003, and the president from 1993 to 2003, but he did not consolidate his power after Deng's death in 1997. Zhu Rongji, premier from 1998 to 2003, and former governor of the central bank, also emerged as an influential leader. Jiang was often criticized for being a weak leader and did not have the same stature as Deng or Mao, the two men who dominated China during the second half of the 20th century. Hu Jintao, leader from 2003 to 2012, for the most part also held to the path defined by Deng, as has Xi Jinping, leader since 2012. Despite the continuing tensions between economic and political policy, some democratic reforms can be seen in these ways. Some input from the National People's Congress is accepted by the Politburo. More emphasis is placed on laws and legal procedures, and village elections are now semi-competitive with choices of candidates and some freedom from the party's control. The Tiananmen crisis began as a grief demonstration for the death of Hu Yaobang, a liberal who had early resigned from the Politburo under pressure from the conservatives. Most of the original demonstrators were students and intellectuals, but other groups joined them, and the wake turned into democratic protests. They criticized corruption and demanded democratic reforms, and hundreds of thousands joined in. Protests erupted all over China, and Tiananmen became the center of international attention for almost 2 months. How would the Politburo react? The answer came with guns. As Deng sent the People's Liberation Army to shut down the protests, using whatever means necessary. The army shot its way to the square, killing hundreds of protesting citizens. They recaptured control, but the fatalities and arrests began a broad new wave of international protest from human rights advocates. Unofficial estimates of fatalities range from 700 to several thousand. Since then, China has been under a great deal of pressure from international human rights organizations to democratize their political process and to abide by human rights standards advocated by the groups. Deng Xiaoping showed little impulse to liberalize the political process, as did the government that followed under Jiang Zemin, at least publicly. Factional disagreements are kept from the public eye, yet Hu Jintao followed the same path. China's human rights record came under international spotlight in 2010 when the Nobel Peace Prize Committee bestowed its award on Liu Xiaobo, a jailed Chinese activist who had been a critic of the government, and was imprisoned after calling for an end to communist one-party rule. News of the award was immediately censored in China. The Chinese government called Liu a criminal and didn't deserve the prize, and Liu's wife was put under house arrest. China asked that other countries boycott the Nobel ceremonies, and as a result, 15 countries declined to attend. The rule of law. The principle of rule of law, almost always associated with liberal democracies, is based on the belief that rulers should not have absolute power over their subjects, and that their actions should be constrained by the same principles that control ordinary citizens. From the communist point of view, law is a part of politics that the bourgeoisie uses to suppress the proletariat. Early communist leaders then never acknowledged the rule of law as a legitimate principle. For example, during the Cultural Revolution, in an effort to bring about his dream of a new egalitarian society, Mao Zedong set about to destroy the old legal codes of dynastic China. However, since 1978, legal codes have begun to revive, partly because the new economic growth and investments have required that consistent regulations be in place that allow China to trade internationally and attract foreign companies. Criminal law, almost non-existent in 1978, has also developed because of the new opportunities for bribery, theft, and inside stock market trading created by the economic boom. As a result, procuratorats, officials who investigate and prosecute official crimes, were recreated from earlier days, and they played a role in Hu Jintao's crackdown on corruption within the Communist Party. The 1982 Constitution, theoretically at least, commits the party to the authority of law. Today, the Chinese state is more constrained by law and Chinese citizens freer by law from political whim than ever before. However, this trend does not change the fact that Chinese justice is harsh by the standards of most other nations, and the death penalty is often enforced for smuggling, rape, theft, bribery, trafficking in women and children, and official corruption. It is also true that no independent judiciary has ever existed in the People's Republic of China, but remains under the tight control of the CCP. In very recent years, a new trend has emerged, according to the Duohua Foundation, an American NGO that tracks trends in China. Over the past decade, the number of people China executes has fallen sharply, from 12,000 executions in 2002 to 3,000 people in 2012. However, the 2012 rate is roughly 4 times more than the rest of the world put together, excluding Egypt and Syria, where numbers are hard to assess. These figures have not been officially disclosed by the Chinese government, but in 2012, a deputy minister of health cited the decline in executed prisoners as a reason for a shortage in organs available for transplant in China. As part of a strong anti-corruption campaign, the 2014 Central Committee plenum focused on the rule of law. Well, the committee made clear that China would not copy foreign rule of law concepts. A resolution emphasized the importance of the Chinese Constitution. It declared December 4th as National Constitution Day and proclaimed that officials have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. The plenum also ruled that all regulations which violate the Constitution must be revised. Despite this new emphasis, the party continues to punish those who challenge it directly. Civil rights and liberties. Since the protests at Tiananmen Square in 1989, the status of civil rights and liberties in China has been widely debated. Many people believe that because Hu Jintao was mentored by Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, leaders of the liberal faction, that he would promote more individual freedoms in China. For example, Hu and former Premier Wen Jiabao took the lead in reversing the party's cover-up of the deadly SARS outbreak, pledging greater accountability and transparency in government. However, Hu showed few signs of changing the government's basic political policies towards individual civil liberties and rights. For example, he adopted new measures to regulate discussions on university internet sites. Several dissident writers who criticized the government were arrested, and a professor who posted highly critical comments of the government on the internet was dismissed from Beijing University. Hu also called for ideological education in universities, a phrase that is reminiscent of the Maoist era. Xi Jinping has continued the crackdown on promoters of Western ideas. In March 2015, 2 members of a group promoting the rule of law were arrested, and during 2015, several hundred civil rights lawyers were detained. Population policy. In 1965, Chinese leader Mao Zedong announced that an ever-expanding population is a good thing. And in 1974, he denounced population policies as imperialist tools designed to weaken developing countries. At the time of Mao's death in 1976, China had about 850 million people with a birth rate of 25. His successors recognized that population growth was consuming more than half of the annual increase in the country's gross domestic product. So, China introduced a campaign advocating the 2-child family. The government provided services, including abortions, that supported the programs, resulting in the drop in China's birth rate to 19.5 by late 1970s. The one-child policy. In 1979, China's new leader Deng Xiaoping went even further by instituting the one-child policy. This program included both incentives and penalties to assure that couples produced only one child. Late marriages were encouraged, and free contraceptives, abortions, and sterilizations were provided to families that followed the policy. Penalties included steep fines were imposed on couples that had a second child. In 1984, the policy was relaxed in rural areas, where children's labor was still important. But it was reinstated in 2002 in reaction to reports that many rural births were not being reported to the government. In contrast, Chinese people in cities were generally more accepting of the one-child policy, since it better suited urban life, styles, and needs. By 1986, the birth rate had fallen to 18, a figure far below those in other less developed countries. However, the policy has had other consequences. One was a rise in female infanticide, or the killing of baby girls. Because traditional Chinese society has always valued males above females, many couples have wanted their one child to be a boy. If a girl is born instead, some choose to end the child's life, so that they can try again to have a boy. The incidence of female infanticide is almost impossible to tally, but the practice has led to a disproportionate number of male to female children. In more recent years, as technology has allowed parents to know the gender of the child before birth, female infanticide has been replaced, at least in urban areas, with selective abortions. Over the years, China's population pyramid has developed a lopsided number of young adult males to young adult females. The problem is so serious that many young men are unable to find women to marry. Some projections suggest that by the mid-21st century, China's population numbers will start falling. If that occurs, it almost certainly will change the cultural tradition of sons taking care of their aging parents. There could be too few sons to carry out the responsibility, leaving China with a problem of what to do about a growing number of elderly people with no one to take care of them. Census figures from 2010 indicate that demographics in China have changed rapidly in recent years. Not only is the ratio of baby boys to baby girls out of proportion, but China's population is dramatically aging. People above the age of 60 now represent 13.3% of the total, up from 10.3% in 2000. And those under the age of 14 declined from 23% to 17%. An increasingly vocal group of academic demographers has called for a relaxation of the one-child policy, and in 2011, one Chinese official in Guangdong, China's most populous province, joined the criticism by advocating a two-child policy. By 2015, many exceptions existed, such as the allowance of 2 children for couples in both partners are single children. Minorities, such as Tibetans and Uyghurs, were permitted the second child, whatever the sex of the firstborn, and the regulations are most relaxed in rural areas where population pressures are minimal. Finally, in late 2015, the party announced the end of the one-child policy, replacing it with a two-child policy starting in 2016. Population movement. The broad trend of population movement from rural to urban areas began decades ago. In the early 1980s, about 80% of Chinese lived in the countryside versus 47% today. The government has long had plans to speed up this process of urbanization much faster than would occur naturally. The primary motivation is to change China's economic structure, with growth based on domestic demand for products instead of relying as much on export. The government took power in 2012, has identified urbanization as one of its top priorities by sponsoring a plan that moves people from rural to urban areas. One motivation for the plan is to find a new source of growth for an economy that depends on increasing consumption of productions by city dwellers. The plan involves moving millions of rural residents into newly constructed towns and cities over the next few years, and tearing down and paving over vast swaths of farmland. This program at least alters the old hukou tradition, page 295 to 296, that requires that most peasants remain tied to their original plots of land. According to the New York Times, in an article published in 2013, the ultimate goal of the government's modernization plan is to integrate about 900 million rural residents into city living by 2025. The transplanting of such a large number of people requires spending on new roads, hospitals, schools, and community centers that will cost the government a great deal of money. Economic policy. From 1949 to 1978, China followed a communist political economic model, a command economy directed by a central government based on democratic centralism. Mao Zedong called this policy the Iron Rice Bowl, or cradle-to-grave health care, work, and retirement security. The state set production quotas and distributed basic goods to consumers. When this model failed, Deng Xiaoping began a series of economic reforms that make up the socialist market economy, a gradual infusion of capitalism while still retaining state control. Agricultural policy. The People's Communes. During the early days of the PRC, in an effort to realize important socialist goals, virtually all peasants were organized into collective farms of approximately 250 families each. During the Great Leap Forward, farms merged into gigantic people's communes with several thousand families. These communes were one of the weakest links in Mao's China, with production and rural living standards showing little improvement between 1957 and 1977. Many communes were poorly managed, and peasants often didn't see the need to work hard, contrary to Mao's hopes of developing devotion through the mass line. Household responsibility system. In the early 1980s, Deng dismantled the communes and replaced them with a household responsibility system, which is still in effect today. In this system, individual families take full charge of production and marketing of crops. After paying government taxes and contract fees to the villages, families may consume or sell what they produce. Food production improved dramatically, and villages developed both private farming and industry. Private business. In 1988, the National People's Congress officially created a new category of private business under the control of the party. It included urban co-ops, service organizations, and rural industries that largely operate as capitalist enterprises. Today, the system of state-controlled private businesses is sometimes called bamboo capitalism. The importance of China's state sector has gradually diminished, although private industry remains heavily regulated by the government. Price controls have been lifted and private businesses have grown by leaps and bounds since the 1980s and are far more profitable and dynamic than our state-owned ones. During the early years of Deng Xiaoping's rule, the fastest growing sectors of the Chinese economy was rooted in township and village enterprises, TVEs, rural factories, and businesses that vary greatly in size and are run by local, government, and private entrepreneurs. Although they are called collective enterprises, they make their own decisions and are responsible for their profits and losses. The growth of the TVE system slowed the migration of peasants to the cities and became the backbone of economic strength in the countryside. However, under Jiang Zemin, a large number of TVEs were dismantled as restrictions of private businesses lessened. Many were privatized or restructured because of the increased foreign ownership of enterprises within China. TVEs remain strongly tied to local governments and the loans they can afford, so they appear to be increasingly less important to the overall economy. Economic problems. The reforms have brought several important economic problems: unemployment and inequality. Under Maoism, everyone was guaranteed a job, but marketization has brought very high rates of unemployment to China today. The Chinese leadership hopes that the booming economy will eventually take care of the unemployed once the economy has had time to adjust to the reforms. Economic growth has also made some people very rich and has barely affected others. As a result, economic inequality has increased significantly. The growing inequality has created a floating population of rural migrants seeking job opportunities in cities. As cities grow larger, crime rates have increased and infrastructures are strained, leaving urban residents with a tendency to blame the new migrants for their problems. Many critics believe that China will not be able to sustain its growth unless its poor begin to share the prosperity, earning enough money to buy goods and services that will broaden the economy. Inefficiency of the state sector. Over the years, the state-owned sector of the economy has gradually declined so that today almost 3/4 of the industrial production is privately owned. The state sector is still large, however, and it is plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and too many workers. Without state subsidies, these industries would almost surely fail, bringing about even higher unemployment rates, so the government has continued to support them. Pollution. As China has industrialized, air and water pollution have become increasingly serious problems. Beijing and Shanghai have some of the most polluted air in the world, and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides emitted by China's coal-fired power plants fall as acid rain on the neighboring countries of South Korea and Japan. Experts once thought China would overtake the United States as the world's leading producer of greenhouse gases by 2010. But now the Industrial Energy Agency believes that happened in 2008. The issue is a real dilemma for the government because China is still a poor country in many ways, and to reduce industrial output could ruin the economic progress of the past few decades. However, evidence that China's air and water are unhealthy for the population is mounting. The government has set targets for energy efficiency and improved air and water quality, but so far they've gone unmet. However, at a summit meeting in late 2014, China and the United States announced an agreement on greenhouse gases. President Obama agreed that the United States will cut emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025, compared to 2005 levels, and Xi promised China's emissions will peak around 2030. Setting such a date is a first for China. Product safety. In 2007, Chinese factories were caught exporting poisonous pharmaceutical ingredients, bogus pet food, faulty tires, and unhealthy shellfish. International outcry followed, and the government has been pressured to do something about it. A big part of the problem lies with the tension between central government authority and capitalism. In order to allow the market economy to grow, authority has been decentralized so that local officials have gained a great deal of decision-making power. As a result, the central government has lost direct control over production, and some faulty products have made their way into the international market. When the global economic crisis occurred in September 2008, many observers believed that China's economy would suffer more than most, especially since its prosperity was solidly based on exports to Western nations, especially the United States. Since many Chinese products were sold to Americans, the decline in American consumption struck at the heart of the Chinese economy, with the country's GDP dropping sharply during the last months of 2008. However, China and many other Asian nations rebounded impressively in 2009, and its economy expanded by more than 10% in 2010. By 2014, China's GDP growth has eased to 7.4%, smaller than increases in previous years, but still far better than the figures for most Western nations. This economic recovery has led many to believe that China's economy was less dependent on American consumers than they'd previously thought. At the annual meeting of the National People's Congress in March 2015, Prime Minister Li Keqiang called for the growth of about 7% in 2015. He called slower growth the new normal. One criticism is that China has yet to develop a consumer economy in which personal spending fuels development, since citizens are still reluctant to let go of their savings. Other critics claim that China has yet to develop an innovation economy, in which goods aren't just cheaper than the competition, but better. Still, the Chinese economy recently passed Japan's as the second biggest in the world, leaving economists to debate whether China was on pace to overtake the United States by 2025 or 2030.